It started in 1974. Idyllic, dreamful, beautiful Uppsala, Sweden. A beautiful cathedral, fifth oldest university in the world, has a beautiful castle. But don't get happy. As soon as I got there, the first November, I realized this was a reality. But that was good because you had months and months and months of time to work. Now, Uppsala, I wish I had a pointer, but Uppsala University, and really the organic chemistry, the physikalisk chemie, physics, were all in this little complex right here. And it was well known for many, many guys like Berzelius, Tiselius, all this Silius business. This was Uppsala. This was traditional, hardcore Uppsala. This was the home of T. Svedberg. Svedberg was the ultracentrifugation guy. He had rooms that looked like engine rooms from submarines, claustrophobic, hot, smoky. And the whole idea was that all of this equipment was there to measure diffusion. Diffusion. And the irony is that within a few years, all of that was about to just be a dinosaur. By the mid-70s, I'm not smart, by the way. I don't consider myself ever being smart. Lucky. And I'll tell you why, if you don't believe me. By the mid-70s, I was lucky enough to join this class as a graduate student. We considered ourselves Led Zeppelin at the time. And I was the lead singer, of course. But I don't think Uppsala was prepared for me anyway. But I want to say that I was lucky enough by the mid to late 70s to have two things happen in my life which were absolutely astounding. Peter Stilps came to Uppsala as faculty from McGill and from working with Story Forsén down in Lund. Now, he was a bright guy, energetic, wanted to change the world, super smart, an NMR expert that University of Lund was famous for in those days. The second wonderful, wonderful thing was this guy behind him, which was the JO FX 100, a shiny, brand new instrument. The Department of Organic Chemistry, their proud little toy. This was a tiny little thing compared to Svedberg's ultracentrifugation monsters. And as it turned out, it was to sweep everything away. The fortunate business about the FX 100 and the things that I learned from Peter really set my path on diffusion. It goes back a long way. 75, 76, we really got hitting the stride by 1980, and everything I've done are things that I've learned from Peter. Now, why is it fortunate that it was the JO FX 100? Because, as you'll realize, it's one of the few machines, I can't use the pointer, it's one of the few machines that had a homospoil built into the probe. Worked for protons, it worked for carbon. The homospoil was, as Peter was to show us, a beautiful pulsed gradient. You could turn the homospoil on for as long as you like. You could save all the data on this fantastic little cassette drive. You can drive it from the light pen. And it was the homospoil, and it was a very clean one. It made pulse gradient and spin echo work fantastic. And after studying the Stayskull-Tanner papers for weeks, it must have been through most of one winter I spent with your paper. And knowing that you were the student, and I kept thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm a student. Hey, I like this guy a lot. I've really spent a lot of time as probably one of your biggest admirers. You never knew anything about me, but I loved everything that you guys did. But the homospoil was fantastic. And in its hands, it really turned things around for understanding microemulsions, colloids, biopolymers. But Peter, to his credit, I don't know if he'll admit to this, but he was the one that taught me that you can learn so much about the environment from just observing things in the microenvironment. Water in biopolymers, methane in liquid crystals, all of these different constituents. If you can understand those through diffusion experiments, you can understand so much about what things were to be. And that's particularly true when we start looking at water diffusion in something as complex as the brain. You could see transitions, you could see dimensions, you could see all of these things, and suddenly now, diffusion in the hands of a simple JOFX100 just changed the field of small particle imaging and colloids and microemulsions, just completely turned it around. By 1980, I was pretty cold. I left the frigid climate of Uppsala, and I moved someplace entirely differently, the Weizmann Institute of Science in sunny Rehovot. And in sunny Rehovot, I was a 2-year postdoc who was interested in studying anisotropy. The first day I got put into a room, I was working with Zev Lowe's, and he put me into this room with this monster big magnet, this monstrous thing, and all this old equipment in this room that I had. I realized that that was a very famous magnet. That was my boom's magnet. Who was my boom? My boom was the CPMG. He was the M in CPMG that I discovered. It was the second high-resolution scanner built in the late 50s and housed at the Weizmann Institute of Science. And I had the privilege, I guess luck, to sit next to probably one of the earliest, most famous magnets of all time. However, what I did was, again, taking a clue from Pietro. You want to understand liquid crystals, as I did. Well, what do? You put something that's highly mobile and can tell you about the microenvironment, such as methane or even chloroform. Methane signal is one peak, very mobile, tell you anything you wanted. So all I needed to do was to build an anisotropic diffusion engine. And so basically, I wrapped a couple coils, the Helmholtz coils, around a Bruker I think it was a WH90, and then put the, just basically wrapped them on there. I drove it with a Israeli tank battery, because that was the biggest source of clean energy I could find at the time. And I started doing anisotropy of diffusion, methane in these liquid crystals. And lo and behold, liquid crystals were fascinating. Not because, they were pretty and they were reflective and things like that, but they changed conformation with temperature. They were the perfect anisotropic medium to study transitions of these small molecules. That small things like methane and chloroform could be perturbed. They could be determined by the environment. And I knew, just like I was doing with the microemulsions, that this was something really, really cool. Use something small to tell you about the environment in which it's in. All right, UCSF 1982. I was terrified. This is the big city. This wasn't Rehovot. This wasn't Uppsala. This was the big city of San Francisco. UCSF, radiology, they were the mothership of everything that was happening in the early days of CT and MR. And if you thought UCSF was where it was at in early 1980s for MRI, you would be wrong. Here's where the action was. Down in South San Francisco, a tiny company called Diasonics made the first whole body 0.35 Tesla magnet. Notice that it was the Diasonics NMR division. As soon as we started getting more and more magnets, and as soon as everyone started to realize this is nuclear magnetic resonance, Alex Margulis and the founding fathers of MR changed it to MR. And so the Diasonics NMR division made some of the best systems of the day. You'll notice there on the left, Larry Crooks, Leon Kaufman. Diasonics was an amazing system. It was the first clinical reality, the first time that radiologists ever thought that MRI could be something. We all got on the bus in the morning, went down to South San Francisco, checked out all the cases, all of this weird stuff, and we just realized that was fantastic. Now, what happened, though, was that a young resident by the name of George Wesby, working with his buddy Dick Eman, came to me with a problem that they could not measure the T2 of liquids like water, saline, all of these fluids. They couldn't measure the T2 accurately. So what do you think I did? I tried everything out. I had an 1180. We had an old magnet up in the pharmaceutical chemistry department at UCSF. And from my background, I knew, what would you think? If your T2 was seriously short, what's going on in the spin echo diffusion these spin echo imaging experiments. There was some gradients being applied, and as it turns out, all the gradients, the slice selection gradient, you had primers, you had crushers, you had B values all over the place. So we knew, or I knew, I thought, that this was self-diffusion, and that was what was going on. So sure enough, if you change the primers and the crushers, we used the slice selection gradient to do this, you found that you had a 0.35 whole body machine that was more than capable of measuring diffusion. It could do so accurately. This was incredible. Unfortunately, in those days, and I'm sure Denis will attest to that, gradients on MRI scanners were crap. They were full of artifacts. They were noisy. They had eddy currents. Oh my God, it was an impossibility to try to push these to a B value high enough to use for routine imaging, particularly on the Diasonics 0.35. But over time, within a few years, something else happened. We bought a GE 1.5 Cigna, which was one of the first in the Bay Area, and GE gave us, as a gift, a 2 Tesla CSI animal system, which was in the basement of the UCS campus. And I, with my new perm hairdo there, decided that I was going to make this a system that everyone would recognize. This was the cutest. It was just the cutest. It's a Nicolay 1280. Look at that. What you couldn't do with a Nicolay 1280. That was fantastic. But in 1988, something happened. A guy by the name of Pete Romer in Milwaukee realized that eddy currents and large gradients were not going to be the way. And he came up with the idea that the self-shielded gradient was not only doable, patentable, but he made one prototype. And guess where that prototype went? On the GE CSI 2 Tesla machine. That prototype that he made, I bought for $75,000 straight from GE, some sort of fly-by-night thing. We drove them up, put them in, and suddenly you could drive B values into the thousands. There was no eddy currents. I couldn't measure anything. So while we were playing around, I had these cat ischemia studies. I hated the fact that we were using feline models. I hated the fact that we were doing spectroscopy. And I hated the fact that T2 wouldn't be accurate for another 12 hours. So me, Yoram, a bunch of us in the lab decided, well, let's just yank up the B value. Let's try these babies out. And then by about 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 B value, we realized something's wrong here. This has got to be artifact, right? No, it kept happening. 12 hours later, the TTC would show exactly where the injury was. I made a lot of money that year betting the neurosurgeon that he was not a very good neurosurgeon because I could tell within 15 minutes whether he had actually created a lesion or not. It was a lot of fun. I didn't declare the money as taxes, though, so I'm not going to mention too much about that now. But it was good for progress. You could follow these lesions. And it had every feature that a neuroprotective or a neuroprotective trial would have wanted. And it became huge. After showing these images at the Amsterdam meeting in 1989, I had, understandably, well, I was surprised. There were hundreds of people that wanted to talk to me after that session. And every one of them had one question. What do you think that question was? You're going to ask me the question anyway. What do you think the question was? Mike, how did you make those slides? I said, well, what about the images? Well, that's motion, that's artifact. But how did you make the slides? Well, we knew that diffusion wasn't enough for stroke, that we needed perfusion, and perfusion in those days was a bolus of gadolinium, a bolus of dysprosium, iron oxide. We did lots of things, and we did what I think is just as important for neuroprotective trials as diffusion. It was the perfusion-weighted imaging. Now, I didn't like boluses of gadolinium, things like that, and I'm sure ASL or perhaps IBIM will fill in that gap. But at the time, it wasn't diffusion, perfusion, confusion. It was some guy who asked me at a meeting, what is it all about this DWE-PWE? They were pronouncing it DWE-PWE, and I thought, yeah, now that's a technique that's going to have a future. All right. Well, when you've got that much B value and you're cranking it up and you're cranking it up, you want to try something out, right? So you go to Safeway, the supermarket, you get everything that's anisotropic, and everything in the vegetable aisle is anisotropic, right? And so we came to the idea that we were going to study celery because that was the simplest thing that radiologists would understand. I asked famous, I mean guys who are just like titans of neuroradiology, what do you think about these images? And their point was, Mike, you spent $75,000 on a bum set of gradients that are not calibrated. It was an artifact. You need to start over. Well, that was the first time and probably the only time celery has ever been seen on the pages of radiology. We did lots of stuff, and Urine can certainly attest to all the stuff that we did. So why not? We had this feline model in the magnet. We had 45 minutes before the next DWI. Let's change the direction of the gradients. And there you go. I knew all about anisotropy from liquid crystals. I knew that water, as the substrate, if you will, was being altered by the environment. And sure enough, white matter was the environment. It was very good. It was very sensitive. And we also presented that at the same meeting in 1989. So that was quite a meeting. The two papers it came out that year. And I had lots of questions. I mean, it's just like, this is an artifact. It's motion. It's temperature. It's a number of different things. And yet, the images were really compelling. I was able to get my wife at the time, I was able to get her foot into the magnet. Little old GE, that's like a 15-centimeter bore. She got that foot all the way into the center. And there we have it, the first time I think that anisotropy was clearly shown. Yeah, so I was all about stroke. I love that part. The anisotropy was cute and curious and fun, but of the two that we were doing at the time, I thought that the stroke was a lot of fun, and we continued to work on that with diffusion and perfusion, and then watch everybody come along and make this a clinical reality. And one of the reasons I want to teach you guys something right now, I may not be the oldest in the room, but I can tell you with compassion that the MR, DWI, PWI community, we're a family. We've always gotten along together. We've always supported each other in our work. We go to the same meetings. We're like brothers and sisters. And I don't want you to forget that we're a happy family and always have been and always will be. Now, Stanford was a nice place. Stanford is a beautiful place. And Alex de Crespigny thought about using diffusion in a dynamic fashion. And actually, if you were to touch the surface of a brain, rat's brain, human brain, stroke, anything that create a temporary metabolic disturbance, you were going to have an ADC change. And Alex was able to show in this cortical spreading depression model in rats. Now they have a smooth hemispheric surface, so it's easy to watch. You can titrate the injury because it moves at 2 millimeters per second. Now this occurs in humans, probably occurs in migraines, certainly would occur minutes after stroke. And work that Alex did there at Stanford in the, probably, I'm going to say mid to late 80s, was a clue that diffusion is a dynamic process. It's not a static image. And I think that has yet to be discovered and yet to be exploited. Christian Bolio came to us, and Chris taught me probably one of the most important lessons of my life at that time. Mike, golf is just as important as research. Never saw, months went by, I never saw you. And he goes, Mike, I'm going to have a lot more time to spend with you if you come play golf with me. But you know, Christian was motivated. He's hardworking. He got stuff done that no one knew about. And he embodies this whole idea that we're a happy family, and we're happy, collegiate. It's great. And Christian, you embody that. Then I had this guy, Chun-Lei Liu. Chun-Lei Liu was very quiet, never said a word. Then he turned up a manuscript that was like 35, 45 pages long, in which he completely turned the idea of diffusion tensor imaging on its ear by expanding the diffusion, the Fick's law, into a Taylor expansion. You can see here that he was not only able to describe the second order that we all know as DTI, but also he was able to account for the third order, which is, of course, the skewness and the kurtosis of that. And then, of course, his fourth order which was the higher order tensors. This was all very new at the time. He was able to produce glyphs. Visualizing non-Gaussian diffusion was difficult, and glyphs was the way that he chose. Very pretty, very colorful, very time-consuming, but I will always remember those days. He called it generalized DTI. And then his sequence was, or his technique was called HOT. I think in Chile, maybe a different name besides HOT. Well, to make it worse, he had a fast imaging technique at the time that he called snails. So the one thing you could say, he gave everything a name. If you ever see something, if there's an entity of any kind, give it a fricking name. Because I'll understand, I mean, I always laugh when I think about hot and snails, but together, snails were hot. I mean, it was just amazing. Now, many of you probably ask, what do old dogs, what do old professors like me do with my time now? I mean, what the hell do I do? It's pretty simple. I want to spend my time on AQP imaging. AQP imaging. Derek, does that look familiar? AQP imaging is the hottest thing on the planet. Yeah, right. Okay. It is. What is AQP imaging? Anybody? Just raise your hand if you know what AQP MRI is. It's DWI. It is. It's DWI in a different dress. That's all it is. All right. I was amazed. GE sent me this pamphlet from China. And this company had a technique called AQP imaging. I thought, that looks like stroke. And indeed, that's exactly what AQP is. And, you know, in the days, we spent, oh my God, we spent months trying to figure out why the ADC would drop in acute stroke. Temperature, motion, aliens. We had no clue what caused this. As it turned out in 2003 in the Nobel Prize, it was pretty clear that the decrease in the ADC, the slowing of water that we thought was an extracellular, intracellular balance, which it was true at the time and still is, was more eloquently explained by the aquaporin 4s. And so aquaporins are the active water transport in cells. There's 9 or 10 different aquaporins. The 4 is the one in the brain. And I got to say that aquaporins is not, I used to fight this. Now I believe that aquaporins really are the reason that the ADC does drop. And in fact, if you read Nature just recently, you discovered that there is a whole new area of molecular imaging. Molecular imaging with MR is no longer gadolinium, it's no longer iron, it's nothing like that. It's aquaporin up and down regulation in cells. And what do they use? A new technique called diffusion-weighted imaging. I've had so many people from molecular imaging, Sam Gambier's lab. Mike, what is this kind of diffusion? Is it hard? I said, no, it's not hard. You do it every day in the hospital. You have a headache, you're going to understand what AQP imaging is all about. So this is the new frontier of molecular imaging. So DWI has now yet another field to explore. This whole idea that the aquaporins are wonderful reporters for everything that goes on. That's what's really brilliant about it. All right, I've missed a lot of stuff, but I'll just keep going. Probably one of the more interesting things was guys at Stanford, you never see these people, and then all of a sudden they show up. He hands me an Oculus Rift, and I go, oh, wow, I can't wait to play virtual reality games. He goes, no, not quite that. Oculus Rift, of course, is owned by Facebook, and he, you know, kind of like has a company like. And he says, here, just try it on. I want to show you what your brain is about. And so after about 20 minutes of this Eurodance music, I realized, hey, that's my entire brain. You can turn the music off, fortunately, but I think what's interesting is that diffusion has been a lot of things to a lot of people. It is a brilliant technique. It's a brilliant idea. It's the way that we use small molecules to understand the microenvironment. I am stunned every day at what diffusion MR can do whether it's acute injury, whether it's virtual reality, whether it's activation studies. It's hard to imagine that in the mid-'80s, it was completely unknown. And now today, it's on the cover of National Geographic. We have entire funding agencies thinking about brain initiatives and so forth. It's a great trip. It's been a wonderful adventure. And quite frankly, I don't even think we're halfway through all of the different things that MR can do. So I think with that, I will close and maybe make up for some of the time, because I realize I am the only thing between you and coffee and then Peter Vassar's talk. So with that, I'll take a few questions, but you have to realize that diffusion MR is also diffusion NMR. They have a world. Peter Stilps is just a pioneer of microemulsions and diffusion NMR. We had no clue what that is. And they really have no clue that you could use, for example, diffusion tensor imaging to watch your fourth grade experiences go by in some part of your cortex. It's just such a big field, and I'm really honored to share my experiences with you. And I'll take questions, but what a great idea. And I'm sure everyone, when you heard about Derek's idea, it was like, I got to be there. I just have to go. And I hope it's the first of many. Roger, let's open up for questions. Thank you.